always the best, and there's no need to fabricate information on a resume, at least in my experience. I omitted that I worked for PETA, certainly, because nobody's going to be letting PETA come in the door. I believe my title was an associate technician when I was hired, and I had access to all the animals in the lab for the most part, and did a lot of cage cleaning, and it really didn't take very long before I was helping to hold the animals for dosing and restrain them for some of the more painful, terrible procedures.
Do you want to grab the front end and I'll grab the back end? That's what we did yesterday.
Testing methods are sort of confined to a handful of well-known tests. Oral gavage, where a tube is shoved down a throat. Nasal gastral, where the tube is shoved up into the nose, and the dermabrasion test is applied on top of the animal's skin after it's been shaved and abraded. Substances can be put into the eyes, up the rectum, into the vagina, injected intravenously, and inhaled. And some of the worst tests to see are soft, fluffy little white rats that are shoved into containers the size of a hairspray can, and they're left just hanging there, sometimes for more than a day, inhaling some toxic substance.
I used to inspect laboratories for the government in the United States, and I can tell anyone who has any doubts at all that in some of the best laboratories I went into, I found beagles with their intestines on the floor left overnight when a surgical wound had become open. I found animals who had puppies stuck in their birth canal and had been left there to die. I found chimpanzees, infants, kept in cages so small that they couldn't even extend their arms over their heads. And those were in whitewashed walled rooms with not a thing for them ever to see or do. So I also know, because I have spoken to so many scientists, so many researchers, so many physicians, that animal research is just a big business. And that unless you tap someone on the shoulder and say, look lad, you've been doing this for 14 years, you haven't discovered anything, time to look at something more modern and up to date than force-feeding an animal, they'll carry right on doing it.
Some of the substances that we were dosing animals with had name brands written on them already. We all knew a bunch of people who were already taking these products and drugs and had been for a number of years. So what's up with the animal testing going on now when we have people that are already taking these drugs? While there were so many animals that I wish that I could have gotten out that I really got close to during my 8 months there, if I could have saved anybody, boy, I wish I could have saved James. James was a primate that was so unlike the other primates in a lot of respects. The animals, the primates that are there, some are bred either nationally or internationally, and some are actually still wild caught. He came from China through a broker in North Carolina, ended up at the lab, and immediately the first time I met him when I went into clean, I knew he was different than all the other primates. He just really connected with me, and I connected with him. And I remember that day feeling, when I left work that day, like I finally had a friend in the laboratory, which probably sounds corny on some levels, but the other primates are obviously terrified. And James was too, but the other primates would run to the back of the cage and shriek and try to get away from people. And as soon as I just gave James a few seconds of my attention outside of his cage, he just reached out for me right away. It was as if he was really accustomed to people. Over the course of the next several weeks, I really spent a lot of time, as much as I could, with the busy workday with him, and he would eat orange pieces out of my hands, and on more than one occasion when I was kneeling in front of him, he would reach out and start grooming my eyebrows and sort of tugging out the bonnet over my hair because he wanted to, perform what his species perform, which is the natural grooming of family members. His behavior changed so radically when the testing started. When he was first acclimated to the ECG ward, he became much more submissive and fearful, and as the weeks progressed, it was harder and harder to get him to even focus on me. He would be sort of scattered and looking around at different things. Because certainly I was a person that compromised his trust after that point. I looked like every other technician who came in and did terrible things to him. But when I see him, it is striking to me how profound this relationship was with this little guy. And while there were so many animals that I wish I could have gotten out,
My name is Dr. Jerry Vlasic, and I'm a trauma surgeon working in the Los Angeles area. My job is to take care of patients that come into a major trauma center that have been injured, maybe in a major car accident, or perhaps have been shot or stabbed. As a physician practicing on the front lines in the trauma centers of Los Angeles, I can tell you that I see a lot of suffering every day. I see people suffering from their injuries. I see people suffering from diseases. And it makes me more acutely aware of other suffering because animals suffer very much like human beings do. That said, I did do animal research for a year. I experimented primarily on dogs. Our project was to try to develop an example of hardening of the arteries in dogs. All of our efforts to produce hardening of the arteries in dogs were frustrated because dogs are carnivores and they don't get hardening of the arteries like human beings do. We would feed the dogs pure cholesterol, and then we would scrape up the inside of their arteries and try to give them hardening of the arteries, and it just never happened. As far as I know, it hasn't ever been done today. So that was basically a year of laboratory research in my mind that was wasted. The vast majority of all animal research is never, ever useful for treating human health issues. It will never be useful because it simply doesn't apply. The physiology is so different in animals from human beings.
Well, we've got the patience today, I really have them.
Now settle down.
I'll shut up. I shouldn't sit back too far.
We always used to joke about the fact that, what are we doing with these animal studies? I mean, why are we studying animals? I mean, this doesn't tell us anything about what's going on with human beings. So there was always kind of a feeling that anyone that was doing an animal study was really sort of not really making a contribution. It was a way of maybe making a living, but it really wasn't something that we would use. I mean, I would never take a study that was done on animals and use that information to treat a patient.
No matter how many rats and mice and rabbits and dogs and non-human primates a drug is given to, ultimately it's given to that first human being. And we know that we can't really extrapolate the results from non-human animals into human animals. So whoever the first human is that takes that drug really is a human guinea pig.
I don't know any doctor that ever used, any practicing doctor that ever used information that came out of an animal study to do anything, or would use that to justify anything that he did with a patient.
In the 21st century, we have much more modern and efficacious techniques for testing drugs and for doing other medical research.
Oh, shut up. That's wet. I shouldn't sit back too far. He's pissed everywhere. You better shut up. Fucking sit still.
It's ridiculous to think that we're depending upon a research method, that is animal research, that might have been useful in the 1800s maybe, when we were still elucidating how blood circulated. But in this day and age, we're looking at things on the molecular level and on the subatomic levels. And to think that we can do that in a mouse or a rat and then apply that to a human being is ridiculous. It just doesn't work. Major research facilities like City of Hope and Cedars-Sinai and UCLA are considered the center of medical research because of a massive public relations campaign and massive amounts of money that are pumped into these hospitals and medical centers by pharmaceutical companies and with research grants. It turns out that when a researcher applies for a grant, and all researchers apply for grants because that's the only way they can stay in their positions, when they apply for a grant from, say, the National Institute of Health, for instance, that money comes in. Half that money goes straight into the hospital. They can use that to pay the janitors, they can use that to pay the rent, they can use that money any way they want to. Then the other half goes to the researcher for actual animal research or non-animal research. But unfortunately, the National Institutes of Health and other research funding organizations tend to lean towards giving more money for animal research because it produces more data and they get more publications. And they're interested in protecting themselves in a legal arena by saying, well, you know, we tested this on rabbits and dogs and cows or anything else they want to test it on, and therefore we shouldn't be held responsible when it turns out to, lo and behold, produce heart attacks in human beings like that drug Vioxx did.
Let me explain something about the City of Hope. It's the golden temple of cancer research. I lost my mother to cancer, my mother's husband, whom I absolutely adored. I lost a lot of good friends to cancer. But what they're doing there, if I took anybody from the public into this facility and you saw what they were doing to these animals, because I was the lay public at one time when I first went into these research facilities. If you looked at it, there is no way in your mind you could justify that and call it science. It's not science, it's insanity.
Ruthless, I think, is the word.
When I interviewed Bill Maher for the TV show Celebrity Justice, I learned he was a free thinker who doesn't have any fear of making controversial remarks. So he takes on issues that other people in the media are afraid to take